must be some kind of way out of here.
Since the beginning of history, human beings have always tried to imitate the flying ability of birds. Obviously, the physical characteristics of humans and avians are completely different. With the light frame of a bird and their wing muscles acting as a propelling force while the tail controls the direction, it was impossible for humans to replicate this mechanism. Flight remained a dream and lived in myth for a long time. Noticeably, Greek mythology of Icarus and Daedalus who attempt to use flight to escape their imprisonment. Although Daedalus escaped successfully with his wings, Icarus did not, just like many attempts of flights by men. Renaissance thinkers and engineers tried to understand the mechanism of flight through aerodynamics, Leonardo da Vinci being one of them. He published the Codex on the flights of birds that would become the principle of the development of human-made aircraft. Then, in 1783, the Montgolfier brothers successfully conducted the first hot air balloon ride, making the first time in history that humans lifted off from the ground. But their creation was still far from the ultimate dream of taking the sky like a bird. After centuries of trial and error, an American brother did the impossible. They were Orville and Wilbur Wright, or the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers has always been fascinated by aeronautics and the mechanics of flight. They opened a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. At the same time, they were working on an invention that would become the flying machine that marks the start of the period of aviation. On December 17, 1903, the brothers took their flyer to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to demonstrate flight. They became the first human to make a controlled, sustained flight on a heavier-than-air aircraft, as the flyer had the ability of three-dimension control and the flight time of 59 seconds. It was a breakthrough. However, it was not well received by the newspapers. The Wright brothers decided to travel to Europe, hoping to get a better appreciation. After the success of the Wright brothers, many more aviation pioneers followed with their inventions. The United States military then incorporated aircrafts in their service in 1907. At first, the air branch of the US military started off as a division in the US Signal Corps. Not long after, in 1909, stunt pilot Eugene Ely flew an airplane off a ship for the first time, marking the start of the American naval aviation. On the civilian side, the first passenger air travel began on the 1st of January 1914 from St. Petersburg to Tampa, Florida. The route took 23 minutes of flight time. However, the St. Petersburg to Tampa airboat service only lasted for 4 months. Yet, it is the giant step that laid the groundwork for civilian air commerce. It would start to pick up again in 1925 when US Airmail Service started giving airmail contracts to private companies, which would start transporting passengers 1 year later. At the start of the First World War, aircrafts are rapidly being militarized. At the time, the United States Air Corps did not have much of a fighting force, so Congress approved the expansion of the Air Corps, fearing that the US would be pulled into the fray of World War I. The United States did not join World War I until 1917, but there was an all-American volunteer squadron, the Lafayette Escadrille, which was an effort of 2 American expats in Paris who lobbied the French officials to form the squadron in 1913. The squadron gained its reputation around the world, drawing hundreds of young Americans to join. The Lafayette Escadrille laid a foundation of early American air combat, and they were the mentor of American Expeditionary Force pilot when they eventually joined World War I in 1917. Another accomplishment in American aviation history was in 1925, when the US Army Air Service won the Schneider Trophy seaplane race of that year, with Lieutenant James Doolittle piloting the Curtiss R-2C. The foundation of modern USAF did not occur until 1941. As the Air Service was expanding in size, Command noticed the significance of having more independent command structure of the air service. Thus, the United States Army Air Force was created. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on American naval base in Pearl Harbor, leaving most of the U.S. Pacific Fleet crippled. Luckily, the carrier group was out in training mission, so they were not present when the attack happened. The aircraft carriers as well as their naval aviators would be the key to winning the war against Japan in the Pacifics. The Pearl Harbor attack angered the American public. President Roosevelt called for a plan to retaliate. Eventually, they came up with a plan to bomb Tokyo. The plan was known as the Doolittle Raid. With Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle leading the operation, 16 heavily modified B-25 bombers would be launching off the USS Hornet to conduct an air raid on Tokyo. This operation was meant as a revenge for Pearl Harbor, but things did not go smoothly. The raid was pretty much a one-way trip because they would not have enough fuel to land in friendly territory, and the aircraft was too big to land back on the carriers. Those planes would have to crash land on China. This daring raid greatly boosted the morale of the American public since it was the first time in the war that damages were done on the Japanese mainland.
Later in June of 1942, America would engage in strategic battle over the island of Midway. Midway is a small island in the middle of the Pacific. It is a key outpost for both America and Japan. The island itself can serve as a base for long-range bombers and maintenance hub for the Navy. On the morning of June 4th, Japan launched an aerial bombardment of the island to destroy the island's air defense, but the U.S. Navy carriers were there to greet them. Both sides engaged on day-long combat, which resulted in the decisive victories for the Americans. At the end of the day, Japan lost all 4 of its aircraft carriers at Midway. The victories turned the tide of the Pacific War in America's favor. Meanwhile, in Europe, the U.S. Air Force made an effort alongside the British RAF to conduct aerial bombing of key strategic infrastructures in German-occupied Europe. The United States 8th Air Force was responsible of daylight bombing. The U.S. operation in Europe lasted from 1942 to 1945. The work environment of the bomber crew was extremely dangerous. Up to 71% of the bomber crew were killed. So U.S. Air Force had 25 missions rule, meaning that the crew that finished 25 combat missions would be sent back home. In 1943, the crew of the Memphis Belle were the first to complete 25 missions and return to the United States. This returning crew would go on war bond tour across the United States, convincing people to support the war effort. Also, it was during the Second World War. The United Air Force would air female pilots. They were trained on the same standard as others, but without the combat trainings. The Women's Air Force Service Pilot, or WASP, were tasked with ferrying planes from air base, and some were flight instructors. Another significant breakthrough was with the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the first black aviators of the U.S. Air Force, formed in 1941 as the 99th Pursuit Squadron. They accomplished a great deal in Europe and played a big part of nurturing the racial segregation in the United States military. After the war, there was a huge effort to replicate the German jet engine technology. Aircraft cooperation all over the world succeeded with the jet engines, but those engines were still going in the subsonic speed. It was not until 1947 when the first subsonic aircraft was introduced. It was an experimental aircraft, Bell X-1 pilot Chuck Yeager, a veteran aviator of the U.S. Air Force. After the war, he became a test pilot for the military and later known as the first man to break the sound barrier. Another important feat of American aviation history was the Spruce Goose, or the H-4 Hercules, built by Hawk Aircraft Company. It was intended to be used as a transatlantic transport ship in World War II, but it was not complete in time. It still is an aviation marvel because it is the largest wooden plane ever built. The wingspan was nearly 100 meters. Sadly, the plane only flew once as the cost of operation was massive and it served no real purpose during peacetime. Later in 1958, Boeing 707 was introduced to the public. It immediately became widespread in the commercial aviation industry. The 707 was said to be the starting point of the jet age in aviation history. The plane dominated the airliner market in the 60s and 70s. They were used as domestic and international passengers and cargo plane. Unfortunately, peace did not last long. The start of Korean War called for the deployment of U.S. military personnel to Korea, and this was in Korea that the new jet technology would go up against each other. On November 8 of 1950, U.S. pilot Russell Brown engaged in the first jet-to-jet combat and emerged victorious. The area of Yalu River was called the MiG Alley because it was the area which American pilots engaged most frequently in a dogfight with the Soviet-built MiG-15.
During the Cold War, Americans made an effort to develop a high-altitude civilian plane to spy on Soviet activities. They would succeed with Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. The Blackbird is prized as the most advanced aviation engineering wonder even today. It holds the record of fastest plane in the world at the speed of Mach 3.3, 4 times faster than airline cruising speeds. The airframe would have to be made with titanium to endure the heat for going that fast. Interesting fact about it is titanium used to build the airplane was bought from Slovenia itself by CIA Cloverleaf Company. At the start of Vietnam War, the characteristics of combat aviation start to shift like never before. The U.S. Army implemented the air mobility tactic as a new means of troop mobilization. Helicopters were essential ingredients of the recipe. Because Vietnam has high mountain and deep jungle, transporting troops by foot or ground vehicles would be inefficient. They started transporting troops by helicopters into the battlefield. It allows for quick insertion and retreats. The Air Force and the Navy also contribute in the war in the sky by launching various bombing campaigns, such as Operation Roaring Thunder and Linebacker. The air war in Vietnam was difficult because the North Vietnamese were using hit-and-run tactics. During the early period of the war, U.S. Navy fighter losses were shocking, despite having better technology than the North Vietnamese. So the U.S. Navy decided to open Fighter Weapons School, or well known as Top Gun. The program aimed to enhance the pilot air combat ability, uplifting it to the next level. Top Gun programs turned out to be a huge success, as the result showing the kill ratio of U.S. fighter increased to 12-1 after Top Gun opposed, which it used to be 2-1 ratio at the beginning of the conflict. In 1965, the U.S. Navy pilot Jeremy Denton was shot down while flying a mission in Vietnam. He was taken as the prisoner of the war by the North Vietnamese. He was imprisoned in the infamous Hanoi Hilton, where he lived in the inhumane condition. Denton was best known for blinking Morse code on the televised broadcast in 1966. North Vietnamese wanted to make a propaganda to show that the prisoner were treated well, so they had Denton read a pre-written script saying everything was fine. While doing so, Denton blinked the Morse code that spelled out torture. This caught the eye of the Navy, and they know for sure that the prisoners were not living in an acceptable environment. Luckily, Denton was released in 1973 and returned to the United States. In the same year, U.S. military withdrew the force from Vietnam, but the fight was not over. Fearing the spread of communists stated in the domino theory, CIA activity were permanent in Laos. During that time, CIA covert airline Air America flew in and out of Laos on transport and recon mission. Air America was a front business for CIA. The true purpose was to conduct secret missions on behalf of the US government. They gave logistics support to Laos to fight the communists and even trained Lao pilots to fly missions on their own. Air American operates a wide selection of planes and helicopters to transport people and ammunition. They were also involved in the evacuation of Saigon in 1975. Following the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990s, NATO countries stepped in to help Kuwait and formed a coalition force to fight with Iraq. The U.S. Air Force contributed over 1,000 aircraft to operate in the Gulf War. The air offensive would start with the Operation Desert Storm in 1991, with the purpose to gain air superiority. It involved bombing airfields, missile sites, and radar sites. By the end of January, Iraqi air power were rendered useless. This paved the way of the ground forces to conduct their operations up to the end of the conflict.
Take me to church, I worship like a